Alrighty, so hold on.
Cider was next on your list. Jason, one that's remaining, wasn't on your list.
It wasn't. It was. I literally just marked it because I saw the email coming in from Christoph. I get an echo from someone. I don't know who it is. Maybe that's me. Oh no, that's actually me. Hold on. I have YouTube running here at the same time, so we have the chat open. All right, so we are live
Sounds
now.
Sounds like you're in an echo chamber, Mo.
Yeah, a little bit. So we're live today about an hour and 15 late because of technical difficulties, but here we are. So do we actually have representation from anybody? I don't think Martin is on here, but Steven, can you take it?
Here, I think Anton's here.
All right, then Anton can talk to this. You're muted if you're talking right now.
Oh yeah, he figures out microphone. Do I have really good premonitions, or have we already talked about this?
Hey, sorry, I didn't notice you are talking about this because it was kind of later. So the way I brought this back is because R9 actually would need out-of-band package for this to be easily usable. Otherwise, they would need workarounds. And from what I noticed, like there are many users who have their own types defined for this feature, and they also are many of them are on .NET Framework, especially the ones in Microsoft. So for me, it makes sense to actually deliver an out-of-band package if it's not a problem. And from my understanding, we figured out how to do it in a safe manner, kind of. So if you scroll to the very bottom, there is the proposal to about how to do it.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm fine talking about this now. I mean, there's a different thing that I proposed the other day of like how to do oobing in a bit more sustainable way. I mean, there's a few things you would like to oob, right? This is one of them. I mean, R9 has, I think, there's also the time provider thing that we need to ship down level as well. And so, yeah, in principle, I mean, the way this oobing always works is exactly what you just did. You just figure out effectively what you can depend on, and then you just, if the parts are that you can't depend on. There is, I mean, I'm not sure we ever shipped iSpan formatable or an iSpan parsable. Maybe we didn't, but there is a package for span for down level already. So I'm not sure whether you tried that.
We haven't shipped that in years. So like lots of the new stuff on memory extensions, for example, doesn't show up in the system memory NuGet.
I
We
see.
don't even have the source. We don't even have the source for quote quote slow spam
I see.
in the runtime repo still.
Then it is what it is. I think like I mean the key question is like if we ship it in the way you propose, does it still work for the R9 folks? Presumably, right? Because we just added those things for consistency with the rest, right?
Basically, they are targeting .NET Standard right now, so the extras with spam parsable, they don't have those methods in their version.
Right, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what Steven thinks. Like my general feeling is like I would not necessarily push them through API review because it's just, as long as you don't want to add new stuff for down level, right? I assume it's generally just a subset of what you have, right? Which I think is mostly a physics problem than anything else. There's not a lot of decision making, right? It's just, well, we don't have the type, so need to if def it
I
out.
think, yeah. So with the reminder that this is about the down level / ubing, I think the API review concerns are the package name basically, and then
right.
if there's layering impacts on that, because so like for crypto, I think we put it in like Microsoft.bcl.cryptography. I think the suggestion on email for this was Microsoft BCL like networking dot primitives, and I don't think we need more dots. Like if we're doing networking down level moves.
If you scroll up a little bit, you can see the package name I proposed. It's basically Microsoft BCL, not primitives.
I feel like, I mean, Emo's got a proposal out to figure out names for these kinds of things holistically.
Yeah.
I'd hope we'd land that and then we'd slot this in wherever it makes sense.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was suggesting. I feel like in general, like, yeah, the only decision point, as Jeremy said, is really the layering, and that is always the cost pretty much for these things. And that's precisely the thing I try to solve-ish. So I think maybe we should just wait until we actually have that. Because, I mean, the other thing is also we should not make one-off decisions. Like, for IP address, we do one thing, and then, not IP address, I keep saying this. For IP network, we do one thing. And then for, let's say, time provider, we do another thing, right? We should follow the same process for all of them. So I guess the question is now, are you blocked on anything? I mean, presumably not, right?
I have an open PR, and it would be nice if we decide to ship it OB, it would be nice to do it in one shot. So it's like...
I don't think that's necessary. We check it in for .NET 8. It's not, and then we update the file as is necessary to include it in whatever other assembly we want. There's no need to block on it.
Okay, then my primary question is like, sorry, I really missed the beginning of the discussion. What is the primary thing we are blocked on now? So figuring out some holistic concept.
Oh, you mean in terms of shipping an out of band package?
Yes.
Syncing up with Emo on what we decide to do for out of band package is all up.
Yep. I will add you to this one, so you're in the loop on this one. Because I mean, as I said, like there's several other components we want to ship out of band. It's not just this one type. And the problem whenever we ship something down level is we add another assembly, we have to add type forwarding, right? And so that's the thing we try to avoid doing, a series of one-offs for. That's basically the short of it. We want to batch assemblies together if we can make it happen.
Yeah, let's get IP network landed for .NET 8, and then we can figure everything else out.
Yeah, this is our general approach for ubing, right? Inbox first, and then down level later.
Okay, then I will come back with this question, like, I don't know, in weeks or months or...
No, it shouldn't be months.
Just stay in touch with Emo.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I want to get it like reviewed next week, and then we can see. I mean, there's an internal review first with the libraries team to see whether we are generally thinking that this is a good idea. And then I will submit a public design as well, so everybody else can see it. So hopefully we can land it over the next, 2 weeks maybe.
Cool. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you have advocates within the runtime team who want to see this down level as well.
Yeah, I mean, down level is going to happen, right? Just to be clear, right? We just don't want to do it as yet another one-off.
Yeah.
So
are we looking at the the .NET 8 API, was that what just flashed up on the screen?
So no, so what we already approved this
Yeah.
for .NET 8, and so what he just basically showed is basically the if devs for down level. That's the thing we just.
Yeah, but there were no modifications to it that we needed to talk about, right?
Correct. So that was just subsetting.
Okay, great.
Just exclusions.
Perfect. Okay.
Which is why
Yeah,
I think it's not really something we would have to review.
Okay.
Because I don't think we have a notion of the parsability as an interface for older things. So changing the formattable and parsable into just formattable is it seems like it's probably correct, and that's the only other piece.
Yeah, and notably, we can't really ship span parsable down level because it's static, abstract, and interface.
Yep. There's like physics involved.
Yep.
All right. So then let's close this one for now. And then the question is now for the JSON one, because I just tagged. Is anybody here that can talk about it, or should we just postpone that and just keep going with the list?
I think Eric's here.
Yeah, so Christoph submitted this relatively large request to change the API, which is why I said I don't think email would be the most.
I think it would probably be best for Christoph to describe this, but I think I'll be able to fill you in. The diff isn't actually as the diff is smaller than the code block you're seeing here. Basically, what the proposal is suggesting on top of what has already been approved is to just mark the properties on JSON property info and on JSON type info to be nullable, as opposed to them being non-nullable in the original shape. But let me just double check to verify that's the only change, but I believe that it is. And yes, so it's basically keeping the same naming conventions, the same API shape. It's simply updating the two last properties on JSON property info. And could you scroll down, please? Okay, I'm wrong. So it's updating the nullability on JSON property info, and it is introducing a new property on JSON type info, both of which are nullable. And the reason for them being nullable is that Christoph wants to be able to add inherit whatever is global configuration semantics. This is something that we did discuss when we last reviewed this, and we didn't actually make a decision to allow that state.
Oh, that one I did not connect the dots. So that is actually a tiny change then.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems totally fine.
Yep.
Anybody, any objections to this?
No.
Right, and so these nulls mean I have no opinion.
Yeah, use whatever's on JSON realized options.
And this isn't actually nullability annotations. This is actually nullable of T.
These are enums, so yeah.
Which means it's actually a really important distinction.
Yeah.
And not a cosmetic distinction.
Thank you.
Of
You want
course.
to clear blocking, Emo?
I probably should have done that, yeah. Yeah, I'm bad with removing blocking. I think it's...
I feel like I get it like 80% of the time.
So I guess this one is, I think, a compiler request, is it not? Maybe not.
I saw
It is a compiler.
Jared like very briefly pop into chat, but I don't.
Yeah, you know why though, right? He clicked on the wrong thing. He wanted to join tactics.
Okay.
Every time I see people that I don't usually hear, I'm like, what time is it? Oh, it's 11. That's why.
Very rarely hear the phrase "someone wanting to join tactics."
That's true.
Maybe needed to join tactics.
Meant to join tactics, yeah.
I mean, Jared likes shouting at people. He might like being in tactics.
So this is a big one, right? So we're not going to look at this one here, right?
Yes, it's a big one, and I have a meeting I need to switch to in 2 minutes. So we'll get this next week, hopefully.
So this is a compiler request. We need to give them a heads up. I will do this for Tuesday then. Tanner, then you are up for some reason.
Yeah. So this is a fun one that I think is overall non-controversial, except for I know Jeremy doesn't
like it.
Jeremy doesn't like the premise of read-only span of byte being the thing we use for UTF-8. But anyways, premise is we have UTF-8. Or we have ISPAN formattable and ISPAN parsable, which works with UTF-16. C# has introduced UTF-8 literals, the official type for that, and is read-only span of byte. And so we are effectively stuck with read-only span of byte moving forward. That's also the type we're using for all of our APIs that take UTF-8 that we expose up until this point, that we've exposed over the past like five-ish years. So the proposal is we expose IUTF-8 span formattable and IUTF-8 span parsable, which mirror the general shape of the UTF-16 variants, but which takes span of byte and read-only span of byte instead of span of char. This will allow the primitive types to explicitly expose support that is equivalent to the UTF-8 or to the UTF-16 support we have, and allow user-defined types to likewise opt in and gain the benefits of having strongly typed interfaces, including use in generics, etc. They'll be able to utilize this for logging and basically anywhere else where UTF-8 formatting and parsing is beneficial.
So on the premise, I will just say part of the reason that I understand that we decided not to ship dedicated types for UTF-8 is it's not supposed to be pervasive, and we're not supposed to do things like this.
Sorry, could you clarify what you mean by it's not meant to be pervasive?
My understanding of why UTF-8 string round, I don't know, what were we up to, 7, failed was the decision that the UTF-8 work should not be pervasive throughout the BCL. It should always be niche and targeted. And
this is targeted though.
Okay.
This is helpers for formatting primitive types, whatever shape you choose to do it in. I mean, we currently have UTF-8 formatter and UTF-8 parser, which are almost this. They're different into some behavioral aspects of what's being proposed and kind of the scope of what's being proposed. But fundamentally, it's moving that functionality to the interface, interfaces on those types, just like we did with math. So I don't think it violates that principle.
Okay, fair enough. So then my point when moving past the premise is we've said UTF-8 should always be visible in the name somewhere. So either it should be try-format UTF-8 or it should be span destination UTF-8 or something. But we've said that when span of byte or read-only span of byte is being UTF-8, the UTF-8ness needs to be somewhere, and the interface is not enough because you'd see byte.try format with span of byte unless we do it explicitly. And so we should put UTF-8s in here somewhere.
Yeah,
I think that's fine. So that'd be UTF-8 destination and I guess UTF-8 string instead of S.
or in the method name, but yeah.
Yeah, or it could be try format UTF-8 and parse UTF-8 and try parse UTF-8.
I would personally much rather see it as the in the parameter name, especially with UTF-8 literals, but not enough to block the API on it if other people don't agree.
Are these going to be explicitly implemented methods, or are they going to like show up?
My own preference would be for these to show up. Enough people use UTF-8 formatting and parsing that requiring them to go through some generic helper method just to access what is arguably fairly primitive functionality is non-desirable, in my opinion.
Wait. So parse implies that the incoming data is textual, correct? So it is actually reading it as, it's reading it from a human representation as opposed to just doing like bit blasting into something like system double, correct?
Right. It would be parsing an actual UTF-8 string.
Yeah. Is the behavior, do you imagine the behavior to be basically identical to the existing parse methods, just UTF-8 instead of UTF or instead of UCS2?
Right. And
Okay.
many of our parsing algorithms actually already take the data and put it into what is an internal number buffer type. And that number buffer type is actually already ASCII representation of the parsed data. So there's most of the backend logic we have will be able to be shared.
Yeah, okay. Because I'm looking at things like UTF-8 parser, which is really ASCII parser, not UTF-8 parser. But if you wanted to mimic what the existing parse methods do, they would actually, honest to God, need to be UTF-8. Like they would need to look for things like non-ASCII characters and interpret them correctly.
Right. We would end up having to recognize the correct negative symbols for the given culture, etc.
Okay, yeah. So I don't have a problem with that then, because it's identical to the existing named methods. Byte and char probably are a bit, well, I guess byte would be reading a byte as a number, like 0x whatever. Char gets a bit weird, but let's say we could pull it off.
Yeah, char would be explicitly implemented.
Yeah.
What would char.parse do?
Char.parse would do the same thing that the explicit char.parse string does today, which is if it's a single character, it parses it out. In the case of UTF-8, it would parse out up to one valid
Good point.
non-surrogate UTF-8 representable character. So it would effectively be able to parse, it would effectively take a string that is ASCII and return the ASCII UTF-8 it would parse out anything that's representable as a UTF-16 character, non-surrogate character, and parse it out. So if you had let's say it's the UTF-8 sequence that's equivalent to the UTF-16 character with the hex representation of 128, it would return the char that is 128.
Yeah, and I
Sounds
think
like it's basically rune.parse and then hardcast to char.
Yeah, with overflow.
Yeah. I was about to say that I kind of makes sense to me. I did not follow what Tanner was saying.
I didn't follow what I was saying either.
Okay, good.
It made sense to me.
I was trying to say a thing, and I think some people understood what I was trying to say, but the words didn't make sense.
Yeah.
Sorry, could you scroll up just a little bit again so we can see the formatable interface? Other direction, the other up.
Up.
Do we need mixed mode formatable UTF-16 format strings and UTF-8 input? No, I'm just kidding.
So, as with ISPAN formatable and ISPAN parsable, these don't have the full set of options that the existing like try-parse method, for example, does on int32 today. That's by design, right?
Right. So if we were to there's a note, I think, at the bottom of this proposal that basically says this doesn't cover the numeric formatting options parameter that int32 and other stuff has. If we wanted to expose those, we could. And we could likewise expose a corresponding dim on I number base. I think that's where the UTF-16 versions are. And so we could still do it all, but I figured it would be better to get through this first and then go back and cover the other ones in a separate proposal.
Maybe I'm just thinking through common situations. Like this would not support parsing hex, for example, right?
Right, not without a numeric format options.
Seems like a big omission because that's a pretty common scenario for parsing strings, is it not?
Yeah. So if we wanted to approve the other today, then I'm fine with that. I just figured getting the core concept out was more important, and we could always revisit the other depending on timing and availability to implement.
Okay. That's fair.
The intent was that if this was approved, to also bring the other one for approval in the future.
I'm just wondering what we would end up doing, because we've talked about versioning these interfaces with DIMs, but there's no good way to implement those DIMs in terms of the other existing APIs. So I don't know how we would add them later.
We would end up having to do it by converting the span to UTF-16 and then doing the actual parsing under the covers. And then all of our own types would, of course, do the efficient thing, and we'd recommend that other people do the efficient thing as well on their types. But that's just kind of the general issue with versioning interfaces over time.
But I don't know how I do that on a custom type. So if I have a type, we ship this, and I have a Steve type that implements UTF-8 span parsable, doesn't implement anything else. What would that base implementation delegate to?
All right, this would have to inherit from the UTF-16 span formatable for that to work.
But my type doesn't implement that either.
Yeah,
and that one doesn't have a similar method on it.
Wait. Sorry. Could you clarify? I was saying that. So if we were to version the APIs to support the numeric interfaces, that would be on iNumber base, not on these interfaces itself. And iNumber base guarantees UTF-16 span formatting and parsing.
But this. So let's say I have a type derived from number base today.
Yeah.
There's nothing there that allows me to parse hex in any UTF-16 or UTF-8, correct?
There is something on there. iNumber base exposes. So iNumber base implements ISPAN parsable and ISPAN formatable, and also exposes the overloads for span parsing and for parsing and formatting that take the numeric format specifier.
I see. What interface is that on? Or that's not on interface, it's on the class.
Yeah, it's on iNumber base because only numbers support numeric parsing and formatting.
But this still doesn't handle the case where you don't inherit number base, you just implement UTF-8 span parsable, right?
Right, but if you're only implementing one, then you're not claiming to be a number type, and so...
So the DIM situation doesn't apply.
I'm not sure I follow.
I think ultimately one of the issues is that, like, because these are all fundamental data types, the way that you parse them is all ever so slightly different. Like, date time datetime would generally be passed in like a datetime parsing options as an enum. String doesn't take anything at all because it's already a string. Numbers Tanner already just talked about, and so on. So I don't think there's a uniform shape that could apply to every single one of our primitives that would allow you to pass in options.
I just looking at iNumber base now, I now understand what Tanner is saying. Tanner is basically saying our interface is ISPAN parsable and this also IUTF-8 span parsable don't have any kind of configuration, number style or whatever because there's no universal thing across types.
Yep.
Our number base does provide such parse and try parse methods. And so if we were to add ones that take formats, we would add those to iNumber base to go along with the UTF-16 ones that are already there.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
So basically it's not a concern for the interface because it doesn't exist on the UTF-16 ones either. So it's not a...
Right, it's not a concern for these interfaces. It would be concerned for the iNumber base interface. Okay, I understand now. That seems reasonable.
Yeah. I would agree.
And then things like datetime would probably get, I think this is what you were getting at earlier, Tanner, right? Things like datetime would have their own methods unrelated to this interface, which take like those enum options as parameters, right?
Right.
Okay. How are you leaning toward making this implement or not implement ISPAN parsable?
I basically looked at what are our core kind of primitive types, the types that are basically in the system namespace. So primarily the numeric types and things like date only, date time, GUID. The functionally primitive types that everybody uses and that everybody has asked for some sort of UTF-8 formatting and parsing for around. I didn't try and do this like holistically as everything that implements formatting and parsing, but just the core types in particular.
Sure, because I'm spitballing here. Like you could imagine not introducing a new interface and just adding parse UTF-8 to the existing ISPAN parsable. And it would have a default implementation that delegates.
You could foresee that, yes. I think we have for the core interfaces like iFormatable, I went with the presumption that it is like IEnumerable, in that it is, because it's been around since the beginning, it is so core and so spread throughout everything that we wouldn't want to add a dim to it. ISPAN parsable, on the other hand, is new enough that likely wouldn't be problematic.
You're basically saying that iFormatable's been around for a long time, but ISPAN formatable and ISPAN parsable are new enough that it wouldn't be an issue.
Right.
We also would not have to return to sometimes we end up having to oob things late. iFormatable shearing makes net standard compat hard.
Yeah, but ISPAN formatable has static methods,
right.
So it can never go oob.
Right. So iFormatable, the thing from like NetFX1 is, I think that one is, we would be afraid to touch it because type unification, net standard shapes, etc. ISPAN formatable is, it's a new interface. Your core only. We can be a little bit more breaky with you.
Yeah, and also iFormatable actually returns a string. Like this doesn't return anything.
Mm-hmm.
You give it the destination buffer. Like if we had a dedicated type for it to return, it could do that, but separate conversation.
Right. So going back to niche versus not, saying if we say that it's a new interface and fine, we put it on the primitive asterisk types, then we're still niche. I think if we change ISPAN parsable to say that we're going to dim UTF-8ness for you of doing transcoding, I think that's probably the wrong answer for people, and B, I think we have stopped being niche at that point.
Why is it the wrong answer? Oh, sorry, Tanner.
I was going to say if we so I don't necessarily agree with the niche that UTF-8 is niche or that people want it to be niche. I think it's actually the opposite. More people want UTF-8 and we need to make it more expansive. But outside of that, I think if we were to put these on as DIMs on iSpan formatable and iSpan parsable, I think we would need an additional property basically saying like, is the UTF-8 overload fast, or rather like is it natively supporting UTF-8 or is it transcoding? Something that users can rely on to identify that bit of information if it was on the core interfaces rather than new interfaces.
I'm not pushing for that approach, but can you elaborate on why? Just because the uses that I have in mind, if that returned false, the fallback would be to do it myself, and I'm not sure I'd be able to do anything more efficient.
So the premise might be that users sometimes you have data that is sourced UTF-8 and they may have been doing transcoding themselves up front and then calling the UTF-16 version of the logger. However, if they know that a UTF-8 version is supported, they may end up wanting to more explicitly do things incrementally via slicing. And there's going to be a large perf difference between transcoding everything all at once up front and transcoding piecemeal as you're doing the logging all together. And so it can make a big impact on which of two paths you would want to use.
I am sympathetic to that, but to be honest, like I've never really seen people call the parse methods aside from on our primitive types.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if in practice it wouldn't actually be an issue. But you are right. One thing that is important to note about these APIs is that unlike UTF-8 parser, these APIs are generally intended to take small inputs as arguments. So what Tanner mentioned about a very chatty API is very relevant. Because remember, UTF-8 parser, like it reads from the very first part of the buffer, the data type, and then it says, okay, I read 8 bytes, I parse those out, and please slice the next 8 bytes off and then give it back to me, right? These parse APIs attempt to read the entire buffer, which means that they really do expect the entire buffer to be a singular representation of a double, which we know from experience is not going to be more than, generally 10 to 12 characters in the common case.
It's not a huge preference, but it's the kind of thing where it's an accidental perf pitfall, and so having some property to indicate, hey, I have implemented this properly and it's not doing the dim thing might be useful, but I don't think it's also required. And so I'd be fine with new interfaces or exposing it as DIMs if we think the DIMs are feasible, given the newness of the two types involved.
Yeah, well, the new interfaces, like you as a caller would have had, like you wouldn't have even be able to compile if the APIs couldn't do it efficiently, right?
Right.
So I don't necessarily know if that's a huge concern, because like you can either do what you wanted to do or you can't do what you wanted to do.
The other
be damned at that point.
Right. And the other benefit of having them as DIMs is that you yourself do not have to expose new overloads of your types to support UTF-8 yourself. Like if you have an existing method that is generic and constrained to iFormatable, you would have to come up with a new version of that method with a different name that is T and constrained to IUTF-8 to not break back compat. So having a dim allows you to support UTF-8 without having to introduce differently named methods. So there's that benefit as well, I guess.
So is the proposal the dim and the new interface, and then the dim forwards to the new interface? Is that...
Well, the proposal as it is new interfaces. But some people suggested we could just do it as a dim on ISPAN formatable and ISPAN parsable, in which case there would be no new interface. It'd just be new methods on the types, and then we'd go and update the primitive types, and we would iteratively look at any other types that implement ISPAN formatable and parsable as to whether they need to natively support it as well.
That makes sense. So the default implementation is doing the slow conversion, and that's why you wanted the bool.
Yeah, that's why a bool could be useful. But
I really don't like
required.
the idea of a bool. I'd rather either just not have it and have them on the ISPAN formatable SPAN parsable interfaces, or introduce new interfaces. I think adding the bool suggests that we really wanted new interfaces and couldn't for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's fair. And I don't think the bool is that critical.
Yeah, I agree. The dim without the bool seems best so far.
Yeah.
And I do want to devil's advocate my own argument here. ISPAN formatable specifically with fallback behavior could be a very interesting design because it might have to pessimistically call the inner implementation multiple times in order to figure out just how long the output is.
Right. It would potentially need to keep growing its buffer until it try-formatted successfully, and then it would transcode that buffer.
Yes, and that might fail.
Sorry, what might fail? The transcoding?
The transcode might fail because the buffer that you're given for transcoding might not be long enough.
Right.
So you would basically have a glorified loop.
Yeah, that's pretty reasonable. You could end up with basically an n squared in your formatting.
Yeah,
it wouldn't be squared, but it would be like it would be probably more than you would expect.
I just mean if the outer, let's say you're trying to format into a byte buffer and you start with a byte buffer of length 1, right? And you call the inner thing, and it let's say the actual output is 1,000 characters.
Mm-hmm.
And so it starts with 128, and then it grows to 256, and then it goes to 512, and then it finally grows to 1,024, and it's long enough. And then the whole thing fails. And now the outer one doubles from 1 to 2, and it goes from 128 to 256. And so you end up with, whatever your growth strategy is, a pretty significant number of attempts.
I mean, the growth strategy wouldn't be. We can discuss that offline, but there are ways to address that.
And notably, we have to do the dims for iNumber base if we expose the numeric formatting options or number styles options.
Sure.
So from
or
that,
a Boolean.
Yeah,
I'd be inclined to go with new interfaces here.
I was about to say, like it seems less problematic in the grand scheme of things.
Would the interfaces delegate back, or are you required to implement them fully?
The latter.
Okay, so they're completely separate from the existing interfaces.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that we would need to say that the new interfaces need to even extend the old interfaces. They're orthogonal.
Okay.
If you want to be
Sounds
a UTF-8 only type, go for it.
Would we have an IUTF-8 number, whatever, for the number styles then? Like, to the other point, like, would we continue along that approach?
No, I think the numerical types would say like you have both, right? Because they implement both, and the requirement is you need to support both.
Yeah, we do the default implementation for iNumber base .parse UTF-8 and format UTF-8 or whatever we call those methods. Or maybe they're just overloads with different types.
Yeah, they're just overloads of the parse with the
regarding
number styles option.
Regarding overloads or different names, for the UTF-8 formats, I don't currently have the ability. I don't have it on this computer of searching to see if we've never screwed up and used parse as the verb where something was taking bytes when we meant decode. And I, in fact, would be surprised if we've always been 100% consistent with using something like decode when it was bytes and parse when it was text. I would expect that there's going to be a parse of bytes somewhere, which means we should call this parse UTF-8 and format UTF-8. We need to name the method to say these bytes are not bytes, these bytes are text. This is where having a type, again, would help. I'm not against UTF-8. I'm against UTF-8 without the type.
So I don't follow. Like, what does it matter what the existing methods are called?
Because if we already have the place that this would fall down is if we have a type somewhere that ends up later needing to be UTF-8 parsable.
Yep.
And it already has a parse that takes a byte array that meant decode this from a serialized structure. It's not using it as text.
You could explicitly implement it then, and that type would be very bad for doing that because it's saying parse, which, as far as I'm aware, we use to explicitly mean text.
We use within our primitives to mean that, but I think Jeremy was talking about like other things within the .NET ecosystem, maybe even within our libraries that are not primitives.
Yeah, within the BCL, right? Because like in CryptoLand, there's the type ASN formatted data. It has it doesn't use parse, so it ended up not being a problem. But it's not format using the sense of text. It's that's also a terrible type. But I know it exists, and so that made me think like we don't always use parse and format to mean text in the way that we do from iFormatable and iSpan parsable. And so I would be like, historically, I think we've been a bit loosey-goosey, and by historically, I mean 20 years ago, we were a lot loosey-goosey of, well, this is bytes, and you understand that means it's different than text, and this says string, so it's text. And UTF-8 string being bytes is making those 20-year-old loosey-gooseys, and anybody who was similarly loose in the larger ecosystem, like it's bringing it into a place where I think we're about to shoot someone in the foot.
Okay, that's unfortunate, but I understand.
I'm okay with it. Going back, sorry, about the iNumber base, is the reason we're okay with the dim there and not here is just because more people like implement iSpan parsable, and for iNumber base, like we'll just always implement it, so we don't have to worry about the default implementation. Like I'm just trying to understand like why the difference there.
I think the amount of custom derived numbers is super low, but the amount of types that would implement this interface is much higher. So I think in practice, the dim implementation will be very, very, very rarely used, if ever.
We also very explicitly made the commentary when iNumber base shipped that in order to support versioning moving forward, new APIs will be implemented using DIMs. We even shipped it with most of the APIs using DIMs where possible from the get-go. So people who aren't updating their types over time will already have the expectation that they may have not as ideal perf and even boxing or allocations unnecessarily happening as they would compared to a proper implementation.
Yeah.
So we kind of shipped with the expectation that DIMs will happen and that they may be non-ideal.
So then, okay, I think we just skipped over the suggestion from Jeremy. We said like yes, but then we didn't really close on what that means. Are we now saying the methods will be try parse UTF-8, parse UTF-8, and try format UTF-8?
Yeah.
That's my preference, just again because of somebody, it's not deserialized, but it's I did save and load, and I believe there are going to be people who have written, parse taking a byte array, and parse taking a byte array and parse taking a read-only span of byte should do the same thing, and these would not be doing the same thing.
I mean, that's fair, but it seems weird that because other people are inconsistent, we now are becoming inconsistent. It seems a bit.
Well,
of
again, but this right. So I'm just saying this comes back to we should have created a type. All I wanted was a char 8 type, so that it was
we've
not.
Had that.
Right.
We've had that.
I know
discussion
we've had
so
the
many
discussion
times.
and we moved on, and I think that this is this is a consequence of that. Is we now can't tell the difference between UTF-8 and binary data. And I think that the verb parse has already been done doing type system overloading, and that's why I think we need to rename the method. That naming the parameter, I don't think is going to be sufficient. Now it could be a minority, and it could be that these people aren't going to implement this interface. So, like, I certainly can't say anything with absolute authority. It's just the big concern that I have.
It doesn't seem like a big deal to me. I could be wrong, but I don't see significant confusion resulting.
I mean, I would also say, like, let's say there is such a type, right? And you call the wrong method. I mean, wouldn't that be pretty clear very quickly that the output you're getting or the input that you're processing doesn't completely like work? Like you get very different outputs from this. It's not just, oh yeah, it works 90% of the cases, and then there is this corner case where you put, that you only notice in production, right?
Well, that would be the hope.
Yeah, I mean, probably.
I just looked
to me, it just seems like if you just look at the primitive types for us, right? Like I think it would be a better user experience than there just overloads where the parameter type says, I take text versus I take UTF-8 text. I think that's a better experience than to completely create new method groups purely because we decided that we think a byte array is good enough as an exchange type for UTF-8.
Fair enough, because I can't search. My instinct says there's in the BCL somewhere there is a parse that takes byte array already, and
there are, but they seem to be like really, really specialized.
And maybe it will be extremely unlikely that they would then also want string parse and format semantics, but.
Yeah, I would say if you have a type today that can decode itself from a string, you have a parse method. And then those are the kind of types that would implement those interfaces. If that's not what you have, because the only thing you care about is binary, then, well, maybe you named that one parse, but then you're also not going to implement the interfaces.
Right. So, so that's just where my concern comes in. Of I'm guessing even we've screwed up and done parse taking bytes. But those types may never care to implement these interfaces.
Yeah, I do share that concern, but I like searching through the runtime repo right now. I don't see any egregious violations of that pattern.
Okay, they'd have to take iFormat provider too, right? Like to be a problem. Am I missing something?
Fair enough. I mean, it would still be confusing user experience of the one that just took read-only span of byte or took byte array and didn't take a format provider. You now have a method group that doesn't have one purpose; it has two, depending on the signature you give it. But the formatting one, I don't think will actually be a problem because it's format is outing; it's not returning. But all right, as long as we name the parameters. I'm just saying, going back to my original thing is we've said that the UTF-8ness needs to be encoded in either the type name, which doesn't apply for an interface, or the method name or the parameter name, whichever seems the most responsible. And
so then
everybody thinks names, we want the method group consistent, then we need to do it to parameter names.
So UTF-8 string and UTF-8 destination.
We say string or text?
Or text.
Or just UTF-8 even. I mean, I'm fine either way, but
I think replacing S with UTF-8 seems fine. Like the whole reason it was named S is nobody'd come up with a good name for that input parameter anyway.
Yeah, the only one would be
have
text,
been calling it text.
But I think, almost all the other ones are always S because in V1 nobody cared about parameter names.
Yeah. More recently, our methods that we've been introducing have called it text or value. Because this is parse, we probably don't want to call it value.
Yeah.
So text would be my preference. Just it matches our modern naming schemes.
Right.
Before you click go, Emo, I have another issue here.
All right.
The format parameter to try format being a read-only span byte rather than read-only span char. We're going to find compositional issues, I think, with that. For example, one of the other issues that should come through API review at some point is just like we have memory extensions .try write, which allows interpolating a string interpolation into a span of char. The idea of, well, we could do the same thing with interpolating into a span of byte for UTF-8. And this interface would be lovely. Like we can, if the target type is UTF-8 span formatable, we just call directly into its try format. But we're going to be getting a string format from the compiler in that case, because it's going to translate the string format from what comes after the colon and the interpolated in the whole in the C# code. Yeah. Unless we update C# to support U8 for that, which we could talk to the C# team about. I think we then would have to encode the format each time.
I mean, the format itself, you also don't write to the wire. So why would we even constrain this to a byte? I mean, it could still be a 16-bit format specifier, because presumably the only thing you do in the implementation is switch over it, right?
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, I think that this is going to be one of those cases like with regular expressions where we say, really, the format you want here is code. You really should be passing in a literal or a short switch option. So if we're saying we're doing the UTF-8 work because of networking and bytes over the wire, then that doesn't justify the format being a UTF-8 string. So
the other consideration is that for primitive types, there is custom numeric format specifiers, which are used by Bing and others. And so having it be read-only span of byte allows them to specify their specify their custom format specifiers using UTF-8 literals, which can then be processed faster as part of the overall operation. I don't think that's necessarily big enough to be a blocker, but that's why I did this consideration. When you have UTF-8, even if you're doing literals for the format specifier, using UTF-8 everywhere just ends up helping with overall perf and usability.
You believe there's going to be a significant difference in parsing the format string out of a read-only span byte versus a read-only span char for a custom format? I mean, there's already a lot of complication to a custom format.
Right. You're processing half the amount of memory, and you can more easily end up representing and covering a lot of the options that way, including checking for just like, is any of this non-ASCII? Is a lot simpler.
I have a really hard time believing it will matter at all. The format strings, even when using custom format strings, they're less than 10 characters long or less than 15 characters long. Plus the parsing associated with those custom ones, there's a lot more that goes into them than just parsing the byte or the char out of it. You're like, you get an MMM and you have to match that against the current month name from the current culture. Mm-hmm. The cost of reading 1 byte instead of 2, I don't think it's worth it.
Okay. So that should be string format then.
Or read-only span char format, I think is what we've used. We used.
So ISPAN formatable, did we say it was should still be a fixed string literal, or did we take Rush char?
I would say
we took Rush char.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then I think it should be Rush char here.
We primarily did that because when you are parsing a composite format string, like we do with string.format or stringbuilder.append format, you're pulling out a subsection of the overall string to then pass in as the thing. So you're slicing basically the string.
Yeah, it's what was between the colon and the close curly.
Right.
It might be worth and I'll start the conversation. I don't think we should block the API on it, but I'll start the conversation with the language team and Steven on if they're going to support, for example, UTF-8 string interpolation, if the language would then require or expect the format specifier to be UTF-8 since it's part of a UTF-8 string.
Yeah, it's a reasonable conversation to have.
And then we can always come back if the language team ends up saying it's something to consider. In chat, I notably also put just the 2 APIs that would go on iNumber base. It's parse, just 2 parse and try parse that take number styles immediately after the UTF-8 parameter.
This isn't necessarily an issue. I think the APIs make sense, but there's a lot of code that backs parsing and formatting UTF-8 16 strings. Do we envision any way of reusing that when talking about UTF-8, or are we going to just see a massive code dump for this?
So like I mentioned earlier, most of, particularly for the number types, I'm not so sure about date time and date format, or date time and time span, but for all the number types, we actually use an internal number buffer type, which is already ASCII. And so I imagine that the vast majority of the backend code can still be shared. We likely won't need to have, massive amounts of code duplication.
That's good.
Yeah, and to your, I think one of the things that you were hitting at, Steve, is for things like date time and whatnot, we already have acceleration within things like culture info for things like current culture and variant culture. It should be relatively straightforward to adapt those to UTF-8 as well.
Did we want to include the 2 iNumber base APIs as part of this, since we already discussed them to great length and effectively said they were fine?
I don't know what the shape is.
I posted it in chat.
Yeah, the host always has trouble seeing chat. Chat basically doesn't exist for the host.
Oh yeah, I'm looking at it. It is basically exactly what we discussed. I would be fine with that.
Yeah, I think the parameters, I use UTF-8 text instead of just UTF-8, but it's the same shape, just number styles immediately after that. So
yeah, it does feel natural to approve it at the same time.
Yeah, particularly since we kind of went in depth on the discussion around it and what it would end up entailing.
Is there, aside from chat, is it already in this issue somewhere, or is there a separate issue tracking it?
Tracking number base?
Yes.
No, I just mentioned it as a we may want to consider supporting this as well.
Okay. Yeah, I would vote for bringing it in as part of this issue then.
Yeah, it makes sense, and we'll simplify some of the stuff.
Alrighty. Then done.
I wonder why we never added iSpan parsable to things like Bool.
We actually just approved that
oh yeah, that was one of the cleanup things. Yeah,
it was one of the things where it got missed because it wasn't a number type. And then we approved it 2 weeks ago.
Sounds good. Then I think we can say this is for today, and then I see you on Tuesday.
All right. Thanks all.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.